We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
President Biden's approval numbers are once again in the tank. And the issue most voters cite as their top priority is, you've guessed it, the economy. But in the grand scheme, does it really matter for the nation's finances who sits in the Oval Office? Well, we're lucky to be joined by Liberty Nation's economics editor and host of the excellent Swamponomics video cast, which you can check out on libertynation.com or on YouTube or on Rumble. We're on them all. Mr. Andrew Moran. Great to have you back, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So in your opinion, Andrew, whether it's a Democrat or Republicans, are the nation's finances going to be sorted out by whomever becomes president?
No, not at all.
I kind of guessed that answer, but why? I guess that would be your answer, but why?
Well, okay, so I've alluded to this slightly on this program before, but the main thing that's driving all of this debt and deficits is mandatory spending. Neither Republicans nor Democrats are going to be touching mandatory spending, which is things like Social Security.
Let's just outline that. I'm sure everybody knows, but just for my benefit more than anything else. So there's discretionary spending, which is what they have the big budget debates about, and we're gonna have a government shutdown because we don't have the spending for. But that's all discretionary spending. So that's what they debate about. That's what they write bills about. But there's mandatory spending that nobody sitting in Congress can really do anything about, or they choose never to discuss or debate.
Yeah, of course they'll never choose it, because if you talk about cutting Social Security or raising the retirement age or doing whatever the case, you're just slaughtered in the polls. I mean, former President Donald Trump, he tells every Republican not to touch Social Security, and politically it's a wise move. Economically, it's not a wise decision, because that thing is going to be bankrupt within the next 10 years. It's going to be running out of cash. But to answer your previous question, though, the reason why the deficits and debt soar is because nobody touches mandatory spending. That accounts for about 2/3 of what the government spends every single year. So the Biden budget proposal is about $6.7 trillion. So if you do 2/3 of that, you get that. That's how much the government spends every single year, and why nothing will ever be done.
Right. So it seems that it's a near constant refrain, isn't it? That one side blames the other for fiscal irresponsibility, and then when they get the power of the purse, it becomes open season on taxpayers. Like the Bugs Bunny cartoon where he's arguing with Daffy Duck, and it's rabbit season, duck season, rabbit season, duck season. But in reality, it's taxpayer season, right? So is that a bug in the system, or is it a feature of it?
Well, it's probably a feature, because politicians are always looking to the next election cycle. Nobody wants to touch the bread and butter of the U.S. government. No one's willing to tackle the meat and potatoes of what drives the U.S. budget. Because if you look at, I always reference the 2012 election when Paul Ryan made some suggestions of what you could do to make sure that Social Security was on proper fiscal footing. They likened him to pushing old ladies off the cliff in wheelchairs. So that's the type of political discourse you have. No one is willing to be serious about it. Democrats will say raise taxes or raise Social Security taxes, but people are taxed enough. And it's an old adage right now, but it's true. The government does not have a revenue problem; it has a spending problem. You see this in all the monthly Treasury statements of the government. Spending 20% more and taking 10% less in. I think that was the May Treasury Department statement.
Well, that's kind of what I want to talk about, Andrew. See, I'm no economist, as is evident by almost every statement I make.
I think you're good, Mark.
Thank you. But it appears to me that if you spend more than you bring in, you're never going to get a balanced budget or pay down the national debt, which I wonder. I mean, you kind of allude to this, that nobody wants to be the person to rip off the sticking plaster. But why is this not the number one campaign message for candidates, presidential, congressional? I mean, other, of course, than the perennial Festivus king, Rand Paul, who really speaks of nothing else, to be fair. So why isn't this a message that would clearly resonate with voters? I mean, wouldn't it, to say that, we're going to have to, because this is how I see it, Andrew. I might be wrong on this, but the debt's going to keep increasing because of mandatory spending. There's really no wiggle room on that. So it's going to keep increasing. And the only way to pay that national debt is to eventually tax more. And so isn't this a question of, people saying, I got to tax the rich, you got to tax corporations. But this tax, it comes down and eventually it's going to hit everybody, all these new taxes. So isn't it really a case of trying to feed the crocodile so it eats you last?
Okay, so a couple of things. So if you were to tax all the billionaires in the United States today, that would keep the halls of Congress open for maybe at most 6 months. It would do very little for the U.S. government. So for your original question of why it's not a top issue, it's not really sexy. Nobody really likes talking about the national debt because that would require
I like it, Andrew.
Solutions.
I like it.
If you remember in the 1992 election, I think it was President George H.W. Bush. Someone of the crowd was asked him, "Why should I care about the national debt?" And he couldn't really provide the answer. I mean, he kept looking at his watch the entire debate. But the answer to that question is, if the national debt keeps rising and you have these higher interest rates, that's going to require more of the budget being allocated to servicing that debt. And what happens when that occurs? Well, you can't pay for other things in the U.S. government that people love, like food stamps, for example. You can't pay for all these things. So that's why people should be concerned about the national debt. But it's not going to be a top issue especially in the state of U.S. election politics, where it's all about sound bites and trying to portray someone as racist or trying to say orange man bad. I mean, Ron DeSantis, he talks about, the policy wonk issues, but not necessarily everybody else.
Okay, I mean,
that's translating the polls because he's not really doing well in the polls.
Yeah. Joe Biden, he's been touting his policy wonk issues, which is essentially a collection of spend more that makes up Bidenomics as the cure to all fiscal ills. Now, well before this became a hashtag for the White House, you've been using Bidenomics, and I guess there's a Reaganomics, there's a Clintonomics, it's always there. But you were using it to describe something that is really, I guess, akin to what you also term Bidenflation, right? Is it Bidenflation by any other name?
Matthew, I'll say that Bidenflation is deflation. But anyway, I mean, what's funny too with the whole
just for our radio listeners there, that wasn't President Joe Biden actually coming into the studio. That was Andrew's very accurate impersonation. Sorry, please carry on.
What's funny about Bidenflation is that he's been asked repeatedly, do you take credit for, is it your fault for what's happening with inflation? And his response is usually no, or it was growing when I got here, which is completely insane. If you look at just look at the CPI numbers, and you see that when he came to office, the annual inflation was 1.7%. He gets in office, passes the American Rescue Plan, passes the bipartisan infrastructure law, all this spending that occurred, and boom, what happens? Inflation starts skyrocketing, and inflation. It's at 4%, but it's lots higher than what the government says, of course.
Yeah, and of course, people have lived through a winter of inflation, or a dark winter, as Joe Biden once told everybody to prepare for it. Andrew, very quick, yes or no answer. Is inflation going to stay around the 4% mark, or do we expect it to go up or down? Sorry, not a yes or no answer, an up or down answer.
Well, it's going to be like the 90s, 80s and 90s. It's going to go up and down. It's going to be a ping pong ball over the next 2 years. Read my articles on libertynational.com, and I talk about that.
Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much.
Thank you for having me.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.